All right, so let's talk about Freud because we didn't get a chance to do so when we were talking about personality. So Freud, as you guys probably know, is the most famous psychologist who ever lived. He probably did more to get the study of psychology into public consciousness than anybody has before or since. And so he's worth discussing, and it's worth giving him his due. It's worth at least understanding the basics of the quite wild theories that he had and how those have gone on to influence psychology. So he was born in the middle of the 19th century in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what is now part of the Czech Republic. And he died just before World War II. He died thoroughly disheartened with the state of the world. He was Jewish, and he saw in Germany the deterioration of the rights of his people, and died really on the eve of World War II before you saw the outright destruction of his people. At the time that he was a young man, the rights for Jews were better than they would be, but they were still not great. And so he had a limited set of professions that he could choose from. He was an excellent student. He was super smart as a kid. And he went into medicine, initially into medical research, where he made important advances in brain anatomy as a very young man, but realized there was no money in research, and so he went into clinical practice, but wasn't really interested in the day-to-day of medicine. He found it very interesting that a lot of ailments, which were considered at the time physical medical ailments, could be addressed with what he called the talking cure, which is what we now see in all the movies as psychoanalytic practice, what psychiatrists are perceived to do, what psychologists are perceived to do with just talking, having the patient talk about his or her experiences, and by doing so, unwind some sort of neuroses that started on early in life. The famous case of Anna O, who's one of the most famous patients in all of psychology, along with some other case studies which he wrote up, led to what are now his famous theories about psychoanalysis. They're kind of wild theories, but like I mentioned before, they're wild theories which have really gone on to shape our understanding of the mind, both in the field and outside of it, in public consciousness. So when we say things like, she's in denial, that's a Freudian idea. That was a Freudian term. Same when we talk about somebody having feelings that are deep down, which are not apparent to their surface conscious self. The idea that we have these deep down feelings, which are not at the surface, that again was a Freudian idea, or at least it was formalized by Freud. The idea of having a repressed tendency, also Freudian idea. He had these really interesting ideas about these various psychological or psychosexual stages that we go through over our lifetime. He, much to the chagrin of the Victorian era in which he was operating, thought that children had active, like young children had active sexual lives, or sexual minds at least. They went through a number of stages, sexual stages, psychosexual stages, including what was called the anal stage, which is when they're being potty trained, when they learn to be either anally retentive or anally, I guess, what's the other expression? It's not explosive, but like making a mess, or like being retentive in their going to the bathroom. And so the idea of being anally retentive, being very fastidious, being very what we would call now high in conscientiousness, that came from Freud's psychosexual stages. And then the idea of compensating for something, that's a Freudian idea, that there's, again, things that you're doing in your surface mind which are actually driven by other things that are happening underneath the surface. And so that idea of something being underneath the surface was part of what Freud's structure of the personality was. So he felt that in our minds, most of the action is happening beneath the surface. So he had this metaphor of the iceberg, right, where just the top of the iceberg is visible. The top of the iceberg is something which is in our conscious mind, and then most of what's going on is this deep, dark stuff that's beneath conscious awareness, but is still motivating our behavior, getting us to buy Hummers and such. And so the part of the mind that is completely submerged, that's completely unconscious, is what he called the id. And the id is this deep basin of animalistic urges. They're the things which are driven just by, I want this. I want pleasure and I want to avoid pain, and that's all that's motivating me there. And the problem is that we can't act just like these id-driven animals. And as a result, we have the superego and the ego. Now, what the superego is a internalization of society's expectations. So the norms and the values of our society, we internalize that. It's not right to be somebody who's completely driven by, say, food or completely driven by sex. And so we have the society telling us what we have to do, and we internalize that and think of it as our conscience. And then the ego is the part in between that has to mediate between society's expectations and our animalistic drives. And it's driven by what's called the reality principle, because it's the one who has to deal with reality. It can't go around and just act entirely on it. That's not realistic. But it also can't simply be motivated by everything that the society wants us to do, because there are these other urges. And the ego is the bit that is most conscious. It's the bit of the self that is readily apparent to us. A bit of the superego is as well, but the id completely submerged. Now, the conflict between these three parts of our personality create a lot of what he called these psychological defense mechanisms. So it might be that the id wants us to do one thing, the superego wants us to do another thing, and then the ego is this mediating thing in between that has to figure out, well, how do I deal with these conflicting urges? And what Freud said was that there's a number of ways that people maladaptively deal with these things that cause problems, but they're driven by these internal conflicts that people have between what they want to do and what they're expected to do. And so one of them is, as we mentioned before, this idea of denial. So denial is just actively denying that the thing that you want is true. So let's use an example. I'm going to use this example throughout a bunch of these different defense mechanisms. In Freud's era, it was socially frowned upon to be gay. Freud himself was actually very progressive in terms of his view of homosexuality and gay rights. At the time, there's this great letter, maybe I'll post it on the Canvas site, but there's this great letter that he wrote to a mother. A mother wrote to him complaining of her son being gay. And Freud just wrote in the 1930s this remarkably compassionate and progressive letter. Anyways, so imagine though that you're gay, those are your id animalistic urges, and your superego is saying it's wrong to be gay. So how does the ego deal with that? One way the ego can deal with that is through just denial. No, I'm not gay. I don't have those urges. Displacement is another one, right? So displacement is when you redirect what you want to do, but is inappropriate, to something that is a more appropriate way of dealing with it. So imagine that you hate your boss or your professor or something, but it's totally inappropriate to lash out at your boss or your professor. And so what you can do is you can go home and lash out at somebody to whom it is more acceptable to lash out at. And so this is a terrible example, but it's one that you'll remember. You're pissed off at your boss, but you don't hit your boss. You go home and you kick the dog, right? So that's displacing something which is totally societally inappropriate to something which is societally more, I guess it's not really accepted to kick your dog, but people find it more acceptable to kick their dog than to kick their boss. So that's an example of displacement. You displace the anger that you feel towards your boss towards your dog instead. Oh, this dog, it's really bothering me. It's not what's really bothering you. Compensation, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We saw the example before. If there's something that you're insecure about, if there's something that you feel is a deficit, you cover it up by emphasizing something else that's positive. All right, projection. This is an interesting one, right? So it's different from displacement. For displacement, what you do is you say, I'm angry at X, and so I'm going to redirect my anger at Y. But with projection, basically, you say, I don't have the problem that you actually do have, but you say, I don't have that problem, somebody else has that problem. So let's go back to the gay example. You say, I'm not gay, you're gay. And so it's different, right? It's different from saying that the object of your urge is something else. Instead, what it's saying is the subject of the urge, which is you are the one who has the urge, is not actually the subject of the urge. Instead, it's somebody else who has that particular problem. So the difference between displacement and projection would be, say displacement is, so you're really attracted to your same-sex roommate, and you displace that attraction to a more societally accepted target, which would be your opposite sex roommate. In projection, it would be different. In projection, it would be saying, I'm not the one who has the societally inappropriate urge. I'm not the one who's gay. Instead, they're gay. Somebody else is gay. I'm projecting what is my problem onto somebody else's. Reaction formation. This is interesting. So what this is exaggerating the opposite tendency. So let's use the gay example again. If it's the case that you have these gay urges, but you believe them to be inappropriate according to society, the superego is telling you it's not appropriate, what you do is you exaggerate the opposite tendency. So if you're a man who's gay, you exaggerate how attracted you are to women. So you exaggerate the opposite tendency. Regression. This is the idea, this is interesting, right? So this is the idea that the way you deal with the problem you have now is you regress to an earlier stage of development. You sort of become like a kid again. It's like you did poorly on a test. You don't want to deal with the fact that you did poorly on a test. So what do? You go home and you take a nap. You do something that like a kid would do. You like drown yourself in candy and comic books or something. Repression, big one. So repression is this idea that you unconsciously keep unacceptable thoughts from becoming conscious. You repress, you kind of just push down all your feelings deep down into where they're not entering your consciousness at all. And you don't even realize you're doing this because it's happening unconsciously. And then the worry is that, well, something happens and these feelings come out somehow. Now, repression in some ways is at the heart of all of these, Chris. You're repressing your actual feelings, and ways that it can try to escape is through all these other defense mechanisms. Now, finally, there's one more, and that's sublimation. Now, it's at the end there because this is the one that Freud said is the most healthy way of dealing with these unconscious urges. And it's redirecting the socially inappropriate urge that you have into something which is socially appropriate. So if you're really pissed at your boss and you don't want to admit it, you go home and you write poetry or something. You don't go home and you kick the dog. You redirect it into something that you think is really important, that you think is socially valuable. So for Freud, a lot of art that was created was this process of sublimation. It was taking something which was an unconscious urge that somebody had, a socially appropriate thing that they had to deal with, and directing it into something that was actually productive.